A dining room in a beautiful house in La Jolla, California. The kind of house with an ocean view that real estate agents describe in superlatives. Around the table, a 60-year-old woman with a careful, composed expression. Her 64-year-old husband and his two adult children with their spouses. The conversation has been pleasant for most of the meal. Then it turns. My stepson Anthony sets down his wineglass with the particular deliberateness of someone who has rehearsed what he is about to say. "Dad," he says, "I think we need to talk about the prenup situation, honestly." Before things get more complicated. My husband Vincent has two adult children from his first marriage, Anthony, 36, and Lisa, 39. My name is Rebecca Shu. Everyone has called me Bobby since I was a child, and I am 60 years old. The man at the head of the table is my husband Vincent Marchetti, 64, whom I married 5 years ago. The man who has just brought up a prenuptial agreement in front of the entire family at Sunday dinner, with his sister and both their spouses present, is my stepson. I want to back up, because I think you need to understand the full shape of this before you can understand what happened at that table. I was married once before, to a man named David Hishu, for 26 years. David died 8 years ago. Pancreatic cancer. Brutal 11-month decline that I will not describe in detail except to say that I learned, during those 11 months, exactly what I was capable of carrying. We had one son together, Kevin, who is now 32 and lives in Seattle with his own young family. David had been an electrical engineer for a defense contractor, methodical and quietly brilliant. And during our marriage, he had also been an aggressive but careful investor. Technology stocks in the 90s and 2000s. Held with a patience that I found maddening at the time and have come to be enormously grateful for since. When David died, I inherited an estate considerably larger than most people would guess, looking at me. I did not advertise this. I am not by nature someone who announces things. I drove a sensible car, lived modestly in the house David and I had owned for 20 years, and grieved in the quiet, private way that felt right to me. I want to tell you about David first, because understanding what he built explains everything that came after. David Shu was the kind of man who solved problems for a living, and could not stop solving them at home either. He worked for a defense contractor in San Diego for 29 years, rising from a junior engineer to a principal systems architect. The kind of role that required a precision of thinking that most people cannot sustain for a single afternoon, let alone 3 decades. He brought that same precision to our finances, though he never made a show of it. He read annual reports the way other men read sports pages. He understood semiconductor companies and early internet infrastructure before most people had heard the terms. And he invested with a discipline that occasionally drove me to distraction during the lean early years of our marriage. When I wanted a nicer car, and he wanted to let the index funds compound for another decade. He was right to wait. He was right about almost everything financial, which made it almost unbearable when he was wrong about his own body. When the fatigue he had been dismissing as overwork turned out to be something considerably more serious. When 11 months became the entire remaining shape of our marriage, I do not like to talk about those 11 months in detail. I will say only this: David faced his death with the same precision he brought to everything else. He spent considerable energy, even as he was dying, making sure that what he had built would be protected and would serve Kevin and me properly. He met with our attorney from his hospital bed twice in the final month. He left detailed instructions, not because he distrusted me to manage things, but because he understood, with the engineer's habit of anticipating failure points, that grief makes even capable people temporarily unable to think clearly about complicated things. He was right about that too. The first year after he died, I could barely manage my own grocery list, let alone a portfolio. I am deeply grateful that he had built systems robust enough to survive my temporary incapacity. By the time I was capable of engaging fully again, what David left had grown. With patient, unglamorous management by the financial advisors he had selected, into something considerably larger than the number it had been the day he died. I tell you all of this not to impress you with numbers, which I am not going to share specifically even now, but to explain the texture of what I brought into my marriage with Vincent. Not luck, not an inheritance that fell into my lap. 26 years of marriage to a brilliant, careful man. 8 more years of patient management after his death, and a lifetime of living more modestly than my actual means would have permitted, because that modesty was simply who I was, independent of any financial reality underneath it. I met Vincent 2 years after David died, at a charity gala for the San Diego Symphony that I had attended somewhat reluctantly at the urging of my friend Yvonne. Vincent had lost his own wife 2 years earlier, a long illness, similar in its cruelty to what I had been through with David. And he was there, he told me later, for similarly reluctant reasons, dragged by his daughter Lisa, who worried about him sitting alone in his house. We talked for 3 hours that night. About loss, mostly, though not only that. About what it felt like to suddenly be the only person carrying decades of shared memory. About the particular loneliness of being a person other people saw as fine, recovered, moved on, when the truth was considerably more complicated than that. Vincent had built his own considerable wealth. A commercial real estate business he had run for 35 years before selling it 4 years before we met. A sale that had set him up extremely comfortably for whatever years remained. He was, by any reasonable measure, a wealthy man. I was, though almost nobody in his family seemed to suspect it, also a wealthy woman in my own right. We married 1 year after that gala. I was 55, he was 59. I had not hidden my financial situation from Vincent. We had, in fact, had a very thorough conversation about it before we married. The kind of conversation two people in their 50s, both of whom had buried a spouse, both of whom had adult children with complicated feelings about a parent remarrying. Understand is necessary. We had each had an attorney. We had signed a prenuptial agreement that protected both of our individual estates for our respective children, a document we had both insisted on for exactly the same reasons. What I had not done was sit Vincent's children down and present them with a financial statement. This had felt, at the time, both unnecessary and faintly absurd. Why would I owe an accounting of my finances to adult strangers I was just getting to know, simply because their father and I were getting married? Vincent had not pushed me to do it, he knew what I had. He had married me knowing exactly what I brought to the marriage, financially and otherwise, and he had never once suggested that his children needed to know the specifics, so they did not know. What they assumed instead, and I understand. Looking back, exactly how this assumption formed and calcified over 5 years was that I was a moderately comfortable widow who had married into considerably more money than I had previously had access to. The math, from their perspective, simple. Their father was extremely wealthy. I drove a 5-year-old Lexus, lived in the house David and I had owned before downsizing into Vincent's home after the wedding, and had never, in 5 years, said a single word about my own finances. Moderately comfortable widow, married up. The gold digger story, in its softer and more socially acceptable phrasing, I had let it stand. The way I had let similar assumptions stand at various points in my life, because correcting it felt unnecessary, and because I genuinely did not care what Vincent's children thought of my bank account. What I had not anticipated was that the assumption would eventually arrive, fully formed, at my own dinner table, in the form of my stepson questioning my prenuptial agreement in front of the entire family.
I want to tell you what led to that Sunday dinner, because the prenup comment did not come from nowhere. I want to describe Vincent's hospitalization more fully, because I think the fear underneath Anthony and Lisa's question deserves to be understood. Even if the question itself was handled badly, Vincent had complained of chest tightness on a Tuesday evening while we were watching television. I had insisted on the emergency room, over his mild protests that it was probably nothing, and within an hour we were being told that it was, in fact, something. Not a heart attack, but significant enough that he was admitted for observation and testing. I sat in that hospital for 4 days. I called Anthony and Lisa the first night, before we knew anything definitive, and I watched both of them arrive within hours. Faces drawn with exactly the particular fear that adult children carry, when a parent's mortality suddenly becomes concrete rather than theoretical. I recognized that fear completely. I had lived inside it for 11 months with David. What I did not fully appreciate in the moment was what that fear might do to two people who had already built an incomplete and somewhat suspicious picture of their stepmother over 5 years of insufficient information. Fear narrows people. It makes them protective in ways that can look, from the outside, like suspicion or hostility, even when the underlying motivation is love. Lisa told me later that she had lain awake the third night of her father's hospitalization, doing math she had never bothered to do before. What would happen to her father's estate, to her own inheritance, to the legacy of the business he had spent 35 years building? If something happened to him and the marriage's financial structure was not what she assumed it to be. She had never asked the question directly because, she admitted later, some part of her had not wanted to know the answer. Had preferred the comfortable assumption that left her with a simple narrative. Dad married someone with less money. The prenup is probably more generous to her than it should be, and we just have to live with that arrangement out love for him. It was easier, she told me, to be quietly resentful of an assumed injustice than to ask a direct question and discover there was no injustice at all. Anthony's research, when his father came home and the immediate crisis passed, came from a similar place. Not malice, but the particular anxious energy of someone who had been frightened and needed somewhere to direct the leftover adrenaline. He had pulled what records he could access, found the equitable protections built into both sides of the prenuptial agreement, and concluded, incorrectly, but understandably given what he thought he knew, that the agreement was unusually generous toward me. He brought this to Lisa rather than to his father or to me. I understand why, even though I wish he had chosen differently. Confronting a parent directly about money is uncomfortable in a way that complaining to a sibling is not. 6 weeks earlier, Vincent had been hospitalized for what turned out to be a minor cardiac event. A scare, ultimately resolved with medication adjustments, but frightening enough in the moment that the entire family had gathered at the hospital. And frightening enough that it had apparently prompted some private conversations among Vincent's children about what would happen if their father's health continued to be uncertain. I did not learn about these conversations until later. What I knew in the moment was that Vincent had been frightened, and I had been frightened, and the 4 days he spent in the hospital had been some of the longest of my life, long enough that I found myself sitting in a hospital chair at 3 in the morning, thinking very clearly about David's 11 months and what it had cost me, and understanding that I was not at all certain I had the capacity to do that again. Vincent came home. He recovered well. Life resumed its normal shape. What I did not know was that Anthony, in the days of his father's hospitalization, had apparently done some research, not malicious research. Exactly. I want to be fair about this, but the kind of research that a worried son does when he is frightened about hospitality and is trying to understand what happens to the family's wealth if the worst occurs. He had looked into the prenuptial agreement, which as Vincent's adult child he had some legal standing to review portions of. He had noticed that the agreement protected my individual assets as thoroughly as it protected Vincent's, which had apparently struck him as unusual for what he assumed was a comparatively modest estate on my side. He had mentioned this to Lisa. Lisa, who has always been somewhat more cautious about me than Anthony. Not unkind, but watchful in the particular way of a daughter who lost her own mother and has complicated feelings about her father's happiness with someone else, had apparently agreed that it was worth raising directly, so they raised it. At Sunday dinner. In front of everyone. I think we need to talk about the prenup situation, Anthony said, setting down his wine glass. Honestly, before things get more complicated. Vincent looked at his son with an expression I had rarely seen on his face. A controlled, careful stillness that I had learned in 5 years of marriage meant he was genuinely upset and working hard not to show it immediately. What exactly do you mean by that, Anthony? He said. Not really a question. I mean, Anthony said, that the agreement protects Bobby's assets the same way it protects yours, which is fine, I guess, in theory. But Dad, we don't actually know what her assets are. We don't know anything about her financial situation. And given everything with your health. My health is fine, Vincent said. It was fine until 6 weeks, as Lisa said quietly. I'm not trying to be cruel, Bobby. I'm really not. But Anthony's right that we don't actually know anything about your finances, and given that Dad's hospital scare, it feels like a fair question to ask. What exactly are you bringing into this marriage? Because from what we can see, it's not much, and the prenup protecting an estate that's small doesn't really make sense unless... She did not finish the sentence. She did not need to. The table was very quiet. I looked at my stepdaughter, whom I had genuinely tried for 5 years to build a real relationship with. I looked at my stepson, who had eaten dinner at my table perhaps 200 times in 5 years and had apparently spent 6 weeks quietly researching my finances. I looked at their spouses, Paula and Mark, who were both looking at their plates with the particular discomfort of people who know something uncomfortable is happening and would rather not be implicated in it. I looked at Vincent, whose face had gone from controlled to something closer to furious. "Anthony," he started. "It's all right," I said. He looked at me. "It's all right, Vincent," I said again. "They're asking a fair question in their own way, even if the way it's being asked isn't entirely fair to me." I looked at Lisa. "You want to know what I'm bringing into this marriage? I didn't mean..." Lisa started. "You meant exactly that," I said, not unkindly. "And I understand why you'd want to know, given what just happened with your father's health. I'm not angry that you're asking the question. I'm only slightly disappointed in how long it's taken and how publicly it's arrived." I set down my fork. "Give me a moment," I said. "I have something in my bag that will answer this more clearly than a conversation will."
I want to say more about the moment Lisa's expression changed because I think it captures something important about the whole evening. She did not simply look surprised at a number. What I watched cross her face was something closer to a complete recalculation of 5 years of assumptions, every interaction she had filed under a particular interpretation now requiring reconsideration. The reluctance I had shown toward an expensive anniversary trip 18 months earlier, which she had quietly interpreted as financial caution born of limited means, suddenly needed to be reread as simply my preference for modest celebrations, regardless of resources. My consistent practicality about household purchases, my refusal to redecorate the kitchen when Vincent had offered. The second-hand furniture I had brought from my own house and insisted on keeping rather than replacing with something newer. All of it had been quietly filed by Lisa and presumably by Anthony into a story about a woman managing on limited means within a wealthy man's household. None of it had actually meant what they thought it meant. It had simply meant that I was, by temperament, someone who did not need or want ostentatious things. Regardless of how many ostentatious things I could afford, watching Lisa's face rearrange around this realization, I felt something unexpected. Not vindication exactly, though there was some of that. Mostly I felt a kind of sorrow for the 5 years of subtle distance that the wrong story had created. We could have been closer, sooner, if I had simply corrected the assumption earlier. The folder in my bag was not a weapon I had been saving to deploy. It was more accurately a correction I should have offered much sooner out of kindness rather than necessity. Charles Whitmore, my attorney, had actually raised this with me months before the dinner. We had been reviewing some routine paperwork and he had asked, in his careful way, whether Vincent's children understood the financial realities of the marriage. "They don't need to," I had told him at the time. "It's not their business. Legally you're right," Charles said, "but Bobby, I've watched families for 30 years. Unexplained things don't stay neutral. People fill the silence with whatever story makes sense to them, and the story is rarely flattering to the person who stayed quiet." I had thought he was being overly cautious. I think now that he was simply more experienced than I was at recognizing exactly the dynamic that played out at that Sunday table. I had not planned to bring my financial statement to a Sunday dinner. I want to be honest about that. What I had in my bag was something I carry now as a matter of habit, since a conversation I had with my attorney Charles Whitmore several months earlier, a printed summary from my investment firm, updated quarterly, that I had taken to keeping in my bag for reasons I had not fully examined until that exact moment at the dinner table, I think, somewhere underneath the surface of my daily life. I had been waiting for this conversation without admitting to myself that I expected it. I retrieved the folder from my bag and set it on the table. "This is current as of the end of last quarter," I said. "Charles updates it for me regularly. I'd like you to look at it, Lisa." "You too, Anthony." Lisa picked it up first. I watched her eyes move down the page. the summary of accounts, the real estate holdings separate from the house I shared with Vincent. The investment portfolio that had grown, with patient, unglamorous management, from what David left me 8 years ago into something considerably larger. Her face changed. Slowly, and then all at once. The way faces do when a number rearranges your entire understanding of a situation. She passed it to Anthony without a word. Anthony read it. I watched the same transformation happen on his face, surprise, recalculation. And finally something that looked uncomfortably close to shame. This is, he started. That's my financial picture, I said. As of 3 months ago, it has likely grown somewhat since then, though I don't check it obsessively. David left me considerably more than people generally assume, looking at how I live. I have never spent ostentatiously. I drive a car that is 5 years old because it runs well and I see no reason to replace something that works. I live in the house Vincent and I share because it's his and I love it, not because I needed somewhere grander. I have simply never felt the need to announce what I have, because it has never been anyone's business but mine and, eventually, Charles's and now, apparently, yours. The table was completely silent. The prenup protects my assets the same way it protects your father's, I continued, because both of us, going into this marriage, had spent decades building something we wanted to ensure went to our own children. Kevin will inherit what I built with David. Your father wanted this protection for what he built, for the two of you. That is the entire reason the agreement is structured the way it is. It was never about protecting a small estate that didn't deserve the protection. It was about two people who had each been responsible adults for decades, making sure their children's inheritances were secure regardless of what happened to the marriage. Anthony set the folder down very carefully. I didn't know, he said. No, I said. You didn't. Because I never told you. And because you never asked me directly. You researched a legal document instead of asking your stepmother a question, and you arrived at a conclusion that was, I think, more comfortable for you than the alternative. That comfortable conclusion being that I had less than you and needed your father's money more than I needed your father. Lisa's eyes were wet. I'm sorry, she said. Bobby, I am genuinely sorry. I think I was scared about Dad's health, and I let that fear turn into something ugly, and I'm ashamed of how this came out. I appreciate that, I said. And I understand the fear. Watching a parent face their own mortality is terrifying. I watched my own husband die slowly over 11 months, and I understand exactly what that fear does to a family. But Lisa, the fear should have made you want to protect your father's happiness. Not interrogate the woman who has spent 5 years trying to be part of this family. Vincent had not spoken through most of this. When he finally did, his voice was quiet and very controlled. I am extremely disappointed, he said, looking at both his children, that this is how you chose to handle a legitimate question. You could have asked me. You could have asked Bobby privately. Instead, you turned a Sunday dinner into an ambush, and you did it in front of Paula and Mark, who deserve better than to be put in that position. Paula Hub, who had said nothing through the entire exchange, looked profoundly relieved to hear her father-in-law say this. I'm sorry too, Dad, Anthony said. I should have come to you directly. I should have come to both of you. Yes, Vincent said. You should have. I gathered the folder back into my bag. I'm not angry, I said to the table generally. I want that understood. I think you were frightened. And frightened people do not always behave at their best. I have done plenty of things in fear that I am not proud of, but I would like, going forward, for there to be more direct conversation in this family and less quiet research conducted from a place of suspicion. Nobody disagreed. I want to tell you about a conversation with Yvonne, because she had seen this coming in ways I had not fully credited at the time. Yvonne and I had lunch about a month after the dinner, and I told her the whole story, start to finish. She listened with the particular attentiveness of an old friend who has earned the right to say I told you so, but generally chooses not to exercise it. I did wonder, she said carefully, whether you were ever going to tell them. I remember thinking, at your wedding, that Lisa looked at you like she was trying to solve a puzzle she didn't have all the pieces for. I asked her why she had never said anything. Because it wasn't my business to push you toward a decision that was entirely yours to make,
she said, and because, frankly, I understood the impulse. You've never wanted to be defined by what you have. I respect that. I just also watched you let a misunderstanding grow for 5 years because correcting it felt unnecessarily showy, and I think in hindsight, the showiness you were avoiding was a smaller cost than the misunderstanding you allowed instead. I have turned that over many times since. The showiness you were avoiding was a smaller cost than the misunderstanding you allowed instead. I think that is, in fact, the central lesson of this entire experience. And I suspect it applies considerably beyond questions of money. Privacy protects you from one kind of discomfort, the discomfort of being seen, of having your resources or your choices examined and potentially judged. But privacy, held too long and too completely, creates a vacuum, and vacuums do not stay empty. Other people fill them with whatever explanation requires the least effort, and that explanation is very often less generous than the truth would have been. I do not think the answer is constant disclosure. I am not going to start volunteering my net worth at dinner parties, but I have learned, since that March Sunday, to be more attentive to the difference between healthy privacy and the kind of avoidance that lets people build entire false narratives in the space where honesty should have been. 3 months have passed since that Sunday dinner. I want to tell you honestly how things have evolved, because I think the honest version is more valuable than a perfectly tidy one. Lisa called me the following Tuesday. We talked for over an hour, the longest conversation we had had. Just the two of us, in 5 years of being family. She told me things she had never told me before, about her mother's illness, about the particular terror of watching her father grieve, and then, 2 years later, fall in love again. About her own complicated fear that loving me would somehow be a betrayal of her mother's memory. She had never said any of this out loud to anyone, she told me, not even to Mark. I think I made you into someone safer to be angry at, she said. Easier than being angry at Dad for moving on, or at the universe for taking Mom. You were just there. A target that made sense. I told her I understood that more than she might expect. Because I had watched my own son Kevin go through something similar after David died, a complicated grief that sometimes looked like anger at things that had nothing to do with its actual source. I'd like to actually get to know you, Lisa said. Not the version of you I built in my head, the actual person. I told her I would like that very much. We have had lunch 3 times since that call. It is slow. Careful work. 5 years of accumulated misunderstanding does not dissolve in a single Tuesday phone call, however honest. But it is real work, and it is moving in a direction I am grateful for. Anthony has been different too. Though differently than Lisa. He is more practical by nature, less inclined toward long emotional conversations, more inclined to show change through action. He has started including me, unprompted. In conversations about Vincent's care, medical appointments, the questions that come with a man in his 60s having had one cardiac scare, and the ongoing vigilance that requires. He asks my opinion, he listens to the answer, he also, about a month after the dinner, asked if I would be willing to talk to him about David, about the investments, about how someone builds the kind of patient, careful wealth I had described that night. He works in finance, has for over a decade, and confessed that he had never actually been curious about my background before, because he had assumed, without examining the assumption, that there was nothing there worth being curious about. We have had 2 long conversations since. He is, it turns out, genuinely sharp about markets, and I have found real pleasure in talking through some of David's old investment philosophy with someone who actually understands the mechanics of what I am describing. Vincent and I are different too. In a quieter way. The dinner forced a conversation we should perhaps have had years earlier, not about money, which we had always handled honestly between the 2 of us, but about how much we had each allowed our children to construct their own narratives about our marriage without correction. We had both, in our own ways, prioritized peace over clarity. And the dinner table confrontation was the bill finally coming due for years of avoided directness. I should have insisted you tell them, Vincent said to me the week after the dinner. Not because you owed them anything, but because I could see this exact scenario coming, and I didn't want to deal with the conflict of forcing it. I could have insisted on telling them myself, I said. I let my own preference for privacy become more important than preventing exactly what happened. We're both responsible for the avoidance, he agreed. We have been since then. Considerably more direct with each other and with his children about the financial realities of our combined family, not because anyone is entitled to a full accounting, but because clarity, we have both come to believe, prevents the kind of corrosive assumption that nearly poisoned a Sunday dinner. Kevin, my son, flew down from Seattle last month for a visit and met Vincent's children properly for the first time. Beyond the brief introductions of the wedding 5 years ago. He and Anthony, it turns out, share an interest in sailing that neither of them knew about, and spent an entire Saturday afternoon at the marina talking about boats with an enthusiasm that made me deeply happy to witness. I have thought a great deal in these 3 months about what David would have said about all of this. He was not a man who enjoyed conflict, but he was rigorously honest, almost to a fault, and I think he would have told me, gently, the way he told me most hard things, that I had let my own discomfort with attention create a vacuum that other people's assumptions had rushed in to fill. He would have been right. I am 60 years old. I have built, across 2 marriages and considerable loss, a life that is more solid than it sometimes appears from the outside, and I have learned, slowly and at the cost of one deeply uncomfortable Sunday dinner, that solidity unexplained can look. To people who do not have the full picture, exactly like its opposite. Yvonne asked me recently whether I regretted keeping my finances private for so long. No, I told her. I regret letting the privacy curdle into an assumption I never bothered to correct. Privacy and deception aren't the same thing, but if you're not careful, the people around you can't always tell the difference. She thought about that for a while. David would have liked that distinction, she said. He would have, I agreed. He liked precise distinctions about almost everything. Vincent and I went to the symphony last weekend, the same charity gala. In fact, the annual fundraiser, where we first met 6 years ago, though this year for entirely undramatic reasons, rather than reluctant matchmaking by well-meaning friends and daughters. We sat through the performance holding hands the way we have for 6 years, and afterward, in the lobby we ran into Yvonne, who hugged me and said, with her particular bluntness, "You look lighter, Bobby. Whatever happened with the family thing?" It agreed with you. I told her it had been a difficult dinner that turned into a necessary one. Those are usually the most important kind, she said. I have thought about that since, the difficult dinners that turn out to be necessary. I think most families, if they are honest, have at least one of these somewhere in their history. A moment where avoided truth finally has to surface, usually badly, usually at an inconvenient time. Usually in front of people you wish hadn't been present for it. The dinner itself is rarely pleasant, but the years that follow, if everyone involved is willing to do the harder work of honesty afterward, can be considerably better than the years that preceded it. Charles Whitmore called me last week with quarterly statements, the same routine call he makes 4 times a year, and at the end of the call he said slightly hesitantly, "I heard from Vincent that things resolved well with his children." I asked how he had heard that. "Vincent called to ask my advice about updating some estate language," Charles said. He mentioned the dinner. He sounded relieved. I told Charles he had been right all those months ago about the danger of unexplained silence. "I'm glad it worked out the way it did," he said. "For what it's worth, Bobby, I've seen this exact situation go considerably worse. Families that never recover the directness. You're fortunate that everyone involved was willing to do the harder work once the truth was actually on the table." I told him I knew how fortunate that was. Kevin called from Seattle the same week, mostly to talk about something unrelated. A promotion at his job, a vacation he and his wife were planning. But near the end of the call he mentioned, almost in passing, that Anthony had texted him about a sailing trip they were planning to take together in the summer. "You and Anthony," I said. "That still surprises me a little." "Why?" Kevin said. "We're basically brothers now, Mom, different fathers. Same weird blended family. It's actually pretty great. Basically brothers." I had not expected 3 months ago sitting in stunned silence at a dinner table while my stepson questioned my finances, that I would arrive at a point where my own son would casually describe himself and that same stepson as basically brothers. But families are strange and resilient things when the people in them are willing to do the work. There is one more thing I want to mention, because I think it closes this story properly. 2 weeks ago, Vincent and I updated the prenuptial agreement slightly. Not the financial protections, which remain exactly as they were. Structured to protect both of our children's inheritances the way we always intended. What we updated was a clause neither of us had thought necessary 5 years ago, an explicit statement drafted by Charles at my request. Acknowledging that both families had been fully informed of both spouses' financial circumstances as of the date of the amendment, it is, in a sense, a legal document confirming something that should never have needed confirming. That we had finally stopped letting silence do the explaining for us. Anthony was the one who suggested we frame it that way, actually. He had been talking to Charles about something unrelated, and the conversation had turned to the dinner. And he had said, half joking, that there should be a clause for full transparency going forward, the way there had been one for asset protection from the beginning. We took the half-joke seriously. It seemed right. Mark, Lisa's husband, said something to me at our last dinner that I have thought about since. He had been quiet through most of the original confrontation, the way Paula had been, both of them caught in a family dynamic that was not originally theirs. I think the thing that struck me most, he said, was how calm you stayed. I would have been furious being accused like that at my own table. I was furious, I told him. I just didn't see the use in showing it in that particular room. In that particular moment. Anger would have made it about my feelings instead of about the facts that needed correcting. That's a useful distinction, he said. David taught me that, I said. He used to say that emotion and information serve different purposes and confusing them usually serves neither one well. Mark considered this. I wish I'd known him, he said. I think you would have liked him, I said. He would have liked you too. He had a great deal of respect for people who think carefully before they speak. I keep thinking about Lisa's question that night, asked with more cruelty than she intended. What exactly are you bringing into this marriage? I think now, 4 months later, that the honest answer is more complicated than the financial statement I produced that evening. Though the financial statement was the answer that finally got through. What I actually brought into this marriage was 26 years of loving David Hsu and learning, through that love, what patience and precision could build together. I brought 11 months of watching a brilliant man face his own death with grace. I brought a son who needed me to be strong when I did not feel strong, and the strength I found because he needed it. I brought 8 years of careful solitary management of what David left, learning skills I had never expected to need. I brought a willingness, at 55, to risk loving again after loss had already taught me exactly how much it could cost. The bank statement was real and it mattered, and it answered the immediate question on the table. But it was never actually the full answer to what I brought into this marriage. I think Vincent has always known that. I think, eventually, his children will know it too. If there is one thing I would tell another woman in my position, widowed, remarried, carrying her own quiet financial independence into a new family that does not fully understand it, it would be this. Correct the story early. Not because you owe anyone an accounting, but because silence is never actually neutral. It is always being filled with something, and you rarely get to choose what. That correction does not have to be dramatic. It does not have to involve a folder produced at a tense dinner table. It can simply be a quiet, direct conversation, chosen deliberately rather than forced by circumstance. I wish I had chosen that path. I got the harder version instead. And I am grateful, even so, that the truth finally arrived, however uncomfortably. Vincent says I am, in his words, the most quietly stubborn person he has ever loved. He means it as a compliment, mostly. I think he is right, mostly. There is room at our table now for honesty as well as ocean views, and I think finally both kinds of room matter equally. I am 60 years old. I have built 2 marriages, survived 1 devastating loss, and learned, slowly, expensively, at the cost of 1 deeply uncomfortable Sunday in March, that the people who love you deserve more honesty than your own comfort with privacy sometimes wants to give them. Lisa is coming for dinner this Sunday. Just her, without Mark. Because she said she wanted some time that was just the 2 of us. She is bringing a bottle of wine, and she told me on the phone a list of questions about her own mother that she has never felt she had permission to ask me, given everything. I told her she has all the permission in the world. Vincent's house, our house, I am trying to remember to call it, after 5 years of still privately thinking of it as his, has the ocean view it has always had. The same light coming through the same windows it came through on the Sunday in March when everything finally became honest. I am setting an extra place at the table this Sunday. It feels, finally, like the right number of places for the family we are actually building, rather than the family everyone assumed we were.